if the UAE is making a seven-figure donation to the organization where you work every year, you're just going to be a lot less likely to say mean things about them. And I
Right.
think at the very least, the consumers of that think tank's work should be made aware of that.
You hear this pushback from these organizations. They're like, yeah, we took the check, but the memo line didn't say don't write about Sudan.
You know, if somebody's giving you $1 million check, they don't have to say, but be nice to me now. Be nice to me.
You're listening to Always at War, the only podcast I'm familiar with that attempts to answer the question, why is the United States perpetually, always, constantly at war? I'm Courtney Rawlings, here as always with Alex Jordan. I don't know about you, Alex, but like my first time, kind of coming like across the phrase or, the idea of a think tank was like probably with the Brookings Institute.
Yeah, I think that's probably the same for me.
Right. Like there's something very Obama era about the Brookings Institute. It was like this real humanist promise, right? Of like knowledge unadulterated, right?
Well, the best knowledge rises to the top, and then our wise policymakers then take all of that data and then they make the best laws. And there's no corrupting influence, and there's nothing that gets in the way of that.
Oh, well, what's so interesting is I never even made it that far. I like, as far as like conceptually, especially in the Obama era, I was like Brookings Institute, and I just kind of assumed I don't know where the money comes from, but who cares? It's probably like an academic institution where there's this like kind of closed door policy. These experts are paid a decent wage to kind of think, and then that thinking is shared with the public. And I don't know, it's obvious naivete. To be fair, I was probably like 21, but that was kind of my understanding of what a think tank was. Of course, now I work at one.
I do think that if you were to ask an American off the street, like I know there's polling on what Americans think about think tanks, and
There is.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a universally positive thing, but I think generally the experience of working at a think tank is telling that to somebody at like a party or dinner or whatever, and they're like, "What is that?"
That's so interesting. I feel like
what was your story?
Well, I'll just say really quick, my experience of being like I work at a think tank has largely been negative. I have to always explain what Quincy is. I'm like, no, not like them.
Right. Yeah. We're not one of the bad ones. We're the good ones.
I'm not selling weapons, right? I'm trying to do the opposite.
Consent
in fact.
for war. Yeah.
They combine the results of their research and testing to bring today's weapons to their highest peak of efficiency. It is their responsibility to meet the needs of today's defense at every point on the globe to which the armies of the free world may be called.
Wait. Yeah. So you said you were going to tell me a story about your think tank.
Well, thank you for bringing it back to me. I was fishing. I was kind of thinking, in anticipation of this conversation with Ben and Nick about like my own relationship to think tanks. And, obviously my time at Quincy has really changed my relationship to them. But I did have a brief moment where during my dissertation writing, which is on something totally not think tank related, I was on mid-century modern architecture. I found myself looking at this, is it 1959? May 1959 Life magazine spread on Rand.
America's first think tank, right?
I think America's first think tank in how we think about think tanks today.
Okay. So like the predecessor to the modern think tank.
It still does exist today. For those who don't know, Rand is still alive and well.
Yeah.
But it definitely sets the standard, especially for foreign policy think tankery.
Right.
It is largely funded, I think, again, still today by the United States government. There's a very close relationship with the Department of Defense, but it was parastatal, right? They are not government employees. The Rand experts are employees at this kind of nascent concept, which is the think tank. First of all, the title of the article is called A Valuable Bunch of Brains, which they like totally were obsessed with when that
goes on. That goes on the wall above the desk. Are you kidding me?
It's like your face. Yeah. And there is a lot of like Yeah, the experts being like in the midst of experting. A lot of their experts are nuclear strategists, war strategists, and then of course just like material engineers, people who build weapons, who understand, infrastructural questions. And there's a lot of images in this spread of men kind of traversing ships that host our missiles, and we're standing in the room, these large war game rooms that they had at the Rand headquarters, notably in short sleeve shirts, not this stuffy DC wear of like the full suit.
Because I don't think you've said yet where Rand Corp was based.
Well, damn it, Alex, that is such a good point. Rand is located on the beaches of Santa Monica, remains located there today, just basically across the way from the Pacific Ocean. What struck me as so interesting about it is the Rand building is a mid-century building. Mm-hmm. The interiors of the Rand Corporation are like these kind of glass and concrete, I think it's concrete facade. The Rand building is kind of like almost like prison cells, but they're at the same time that they're prison cells, they're also like botanical cells, and that they open and are kind of organic, right? And it kind of stems this dichotomy, right? It's like right in between prison and organic. It's right in between showing you everything and barricading information. And I love that kind of architectural, like that the architects intentionally or not, or definitely intentionally, but consciously or not, kind of made physical this antinomy that exists within the military complex today, right? Which is like, it's for the people, but it's not. The people can't be part of this. It's actually just for the experts. We want you to know everything, but only what we decide for you to know also. Inside, there's a lot of teaks and woods, and it's very it's very mid-century modern. It is the height of kind of the mid-century modern aesthetic when it becomes a kind of aesthetic of it becomes very Americana. Mm-hmm. But what struck me is that the origins of mid-century modernism are for the working classes. So the reason you have these kind of bare materials, these simplified forms, these kind of low-cost materials are because, especially during wartime, in order to build housing for poor peoples, working class peoples, and then increasingly war workers, you needed these kind of cheap, readily available materials, largely excluding things like metals, right, which were being pushed toward the war project. And so mid-century modern in its earliest phases is associated with working people. And of course, fast forward just 10, 15 years later, the people at Rand are cozied up in these mid-century modern interiors. In fact, there's also another photograph of Albert Wolfstetter, a nuclear strategist, at his home with his colleagues in this very lush, beautifully decorated interior. He owned a home by the mid-century modern architect Joseph Vanderker. And in fact, his home was photographed by Julius Schulman, who, those who don't know, was a famous photographer of mid-century modern interiors and buildings in general. And so it's just this funny time in history where, these literal war profiteers and planners and the people who kind of help build out what we know today as the military-industrial complex are living in the aesthetic or in the surround of what we would associate with a peacenik. That is like this California cool aesthetic had been depoliticized and therefore was easily co-opted by the literal military-industrial complex.
It's funny because I definitely don't think that think tanks these days sit anywhere near the center of cultural cool or vibe. It's very interesting also to think about at the moment of the rise of this, like you described, parastatal institution, this thing that is built out to fundamentally insulate U.S. defense planning and strategy from democratic inputs. Like, so much of the post-World War II build out of the national security state, whether that's the development of the think tanks, that's the creation of the NSC, all these things that make this national security state bigger and more bloated and less accountable and more dispersed. It's just interesting to think about the elite investment, I guess, like going and doing a photo shoot and like getting the best architects and really trying to consciously position this institution as this thoroughly up and coming, young, dynamic American thing.
When you see them climbing the kind of rope, the ropes that lead up to the missile system out on the ships, right? It's like, oh, this is someone who's embodied, who's not just a brain in a vat. He, gets out there and does what needs to be done,
Well, can I draw a parallel to today? It strikes me that our friends in Silicon Valley, Palmer Luckey with Anduril, he wears a Hawaiian
Nothing
shirt
cooler than a man in a
Hawaiian shirt. But that's like a whole part of the presentation, and they have all their ads are like fake spray painted on the side of a train or whatever, like trying to bring counterculture back to like literally producing producing weapons for the American state.
One of the surest ways to prevent this war is to prepare for all its possibilities, as we are preparing through military and scientific activities like C-Day.
Yeah, so I just thought that would be a fun little vignette to bring with us into our conversation today.
Courtney, we've got two friends who are like kind of perfect for this. I'm thinking Ben Freeman. He's the director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy Program at the Quincy Institute. He investigates money in politics, defense spending, foreign influence in America, and the intersection of those things, which are think tanks. And he's also the author of an upcoming book, The $1 Trillion War Machine, which you will be hearing much more about from us this fall. And then I'm also thinking we bring in Ben's partner in fighting corruption in U.S. foreign policy, Nick Cleveland-Stout. Nick is a research associate on the Democratizing Foreign Policy Program, and Ben and Nick together created this first-of-its-kind database which tracks the funding that America's top think tanks receive from weapons companies, foreign governments, and the U.S. government itself. Let's call him now, Courtney.
Okay.
Ben? Nick?
Hey.
Hey, how's it going?
This is Alex, and you know my friend Courtney?
I'm familiar.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thanks for answering, you guys. I have so many questions for you. So earlier today, I was talking to Alex. Well, really talking to myself, but Alex was kind of taking it all in intravenously.
Watching you talk to yourself. Yeah.
Talking about kind of, early think tanks, especially. I guess one of the major questions I have for you guys that I keep coming back to is, what exactly is a think tank?
It's always a much more complicated question than it seems, because there is technically no legal definition for a think tank. But generally speaking, think tanks are think tankers are the experts that are quoted in the media, that appear on TV, that testify to Congress, that in some cases advise lawmakers themselves. And yeah, a lot of listeners will likely be familiar with, RAND, for example. That was kind of the model for a long time, which is U.S. government-supported think tanks that are geared towards answering specific questions, outsourcing expertise. But the more typical model for think tanks today is a DC-based think tank. Think like a Brookings or a Council on Foreign Relations or a Center for Strategic and International Studies. These are think tanks that are based in DC, and rather than being reliant on U.S. government funding, a lot of them are reliant, as we're going to get into, on special interest funding. Corporations, foreign governments, defense contractors, and crucially, think tanks very much present themselves as very academic, buttoned up organizations that are simply there to represent the American people and try and steer the U.S. in the direction of U.S. national interest. They wrap it up in this bow tie of U.S. national interest. But in reality, as we look under the hood of who's funding think tanks and these relationships that they have with their donors, that's not always the case. And in fact, a lot of think tanks actually are quite dependent on their donors and oftentimes toe the line of what their defense contractor donors and foreign government donors might want them to say.
Before I get to like foreign money and all these, I know I've, obviously been following your work. We actually work together. Spoiler alert for anyone listening. So I'm pretty familiar with what you guys have been working on about like the modern think tank. But like, I guess when I've been asked, like, because another spoiler alert, we work for a think tank. Okay. So when I'm asked like, what is a think tank? One of the things that I answer is like, well, it's this kind of like extra governmental advisory agency, right? And that like kind of speaks to what you're talking about, this kind of buttoned up academic institution intended to give the government like, well thought out arguments for doing X, Y, or Z. And you may not know the answer to this. And this is like a genuine question, but like, why doesn't the government do their own research? And then like, or for RAND, for instance, right, the U.S. helps fund places like the RAND Corporation and then several other think tanks, but RAND being one of the more famous. So they're funding this like extra governmental foundation. Is that why?
The government does have, a lot of scientists on staff, plenty of excellent researchers. You think of places like the National Institutes of Health, various, Centers for Disease Control. They have brilliant infectious disease specialists and, other folks like that on staff. So the government does have some of this capability. Where I think think tanks at least can really come in is in the areas where the government really doesn't have that expertise as much. And this is what RAND is the perfect model of this, where, the RAND is considered like the DoD think tank, the military's think tank. And, it's the military's job, at least in theory, to fight wars. And so they don't have a lot of this capability internally. And so they sort of turn over the research, a lot of the, big think projects over to a place like RAND so they can get kind of out of those bureaucratic silos that are existing in DoD and that exist in all these other government agencies too.
There's also this kind of historical trend where we've it used to be the case that there were all these federally funded research and development centers, FFRDCs as they're called, in which the government, it was born out, like after World War II, born out of the Cold War, this milieu of federally funded researchers that could help provide expertise, kind of be like the brains of the Cold War largely. A lot of people from RAND were called to serve in the Kennedy administration, for instance. They would typically adopt kind of quantitative methods, but some use of quantitative and qualitative as well. But I think you see over time, the government, as expertise is devalued over time, and corporations really rise in America in the 70s and 80s in particular, we move away from this reliance on FFRDCs on places like RAND, which still exists, but it just became supplanted in a way by Heritage, Brookings, and people saw Heritage was the first one to really do this and show that a model like this could be successful. And what those FFRDCs aren't is overtly political. And so you have Heritage, which breaks off from American Enterprise Institute, which is another center of right think tank. They very much decide to enter the political process. Even their location, if you're familiar with DC geography, they're right next to Capitol Hill. And so they were upset that AEI was not as involved in the political process. They wanted to be kind of a political engine. And so they were, and they succeeded, backing Ronald Reagan. And, there's these incredible stories about like Reagan handing out a copy of Mandate for Leadership, this book that the Heritage Foundation produced, to all of his cabinet members. And a lot of think tanks saw the success of Heritage and wanted to replicate it. So you had like Brookings, for example, do the same thing. They hired a consultant, a consulting firm in I think it was 1981 to basically see like how can we build out our organization and be more effective. And whenever you hire a consulting firm, they typically say, look to the private sector, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they said. Why chase after U.S. government grants that tend to be focused on like long-term projects, more big picture research questions, when you can just get core funding or project-based funding from corporations, defense contractors, foreign governments, in some cases. And so over time, you just see the think tank industry, the think tank model move towards that trend until where we are today.
Will you guys talk a little bit about like why it's important to understand why think tanks are funded the way they are, why it's important to have some window or some insight into where these organizations get their support? And I guess particularly if over time they've become, if the government has farmed out its policymaking and its deep thinking to these institutions, why does it then matter if we know who helps these institutions keep their lights on?
It goes back to what Nick said earlier about the sort of drift in the think tank space over time. It really goes back to Courtney's question, which I'm sorry I had such a bad visceral reaction to when we opened this. But the reason I had that was that there's really no such thing as a think tank. As Nick said, there's no IRS definition, but yet at the same time, there's over 1,000 so-called think tanks in the U.S., and they're all different in their own little ways. But what we've seen in terms of the trend of the industry over time is it's away from this kind of ivory tower light, bridge between academia and the policy process. That's the way think tanks were once upon a time, or think tanks are in theory. The reality of think tanks today is that think tanks are literally writing the laws of the land in some cases. If you're a think tanker, one of your top goals is to help write legislation. You're writing talking points that you're sending to members of Congress. You're writing questions to them that they're asking in hearings. You are testifying yourself at congressional hearings. I'm not making this up. I've done all of those things. And, I am proud of all of those things. So I've helped to write legislation, and a lot of things. I'm not unique. Every think tanker out there is doing or striving to do those things. So when you think of it that way, think tanks are functioning a lot like lobbyists. They're functioning a lot like public relations firms. They're the talking head that you see on TV, CNN, or you hear on NPR, wherever you're getting your news. Chances are, if you're hearing from some policy expert, you're hearing from a think tanker who's got some money behind them that might be biasing their opinion.
And if I can relate it to the wonderful title of this show, Always at War, I think if you look at the history of think tanks, like it shows that they are very much geared towards supremacy, geared towards military first approaches. We just to tease out this like think tank funding project that we did, and we'll continue to update. It's called the Think Tank Funding Tracker, available at thinktankfundingtracker.org. We looked at the top 50 foreign policy think tanks going back, looking at their funding sources going back about 5 years. And one of the things that we found from that is that it turns out think tanks take a whole lot of money from defense contractors that obviously have every incentive to want to sell more and more weapons to not just the U.S. government, but foreign governments as well, which also fund think tanks to the tune of $110 million over the last 5 years. And so, looking at like the recent past, I mean, the Iraq War, for instance, was a disaster that was cheerled by think tanks. The Project for a New American Century, for instance, was a think tank. It's now defunct, but it was formed in 1997 by a group of neoconservatives. Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, John Bolton was involved with the project.
Some real winners.
Real winners that have never.
You got it right.
Yes.
No. All right.
Hey,
Nick,
don't insult future guests of the podcast, please.
That's right. I forgot Bill's coming on next week.
I'm burning your bridges. Oh.
Speaking of burning bridges, Nick, it sounds like you are coming out against this, which is a little confusing. And by this, I mean like defense contractors funding think tanks, which is a little confusing because at the top, you told me quite clearly that think tanks are run by and intended to be research institutions that are unbiased and just providing the government with what they need to know. So I feel a little confused by your seeming reticence
She's hurt.
about defense contractors.
That's a good point, Courtney. I think, you might sense a little bit of a tone in my voice, and that is because, defense contractor funding of think tanks, I think, can very much. It's certainly a part of the reason why we're in the situation that we're in, which is, why are we always at war? And I think that if we, think tanks, I'll just add to what I said earlier, which is like, not only are they seen as like these very objective organizations, and by the way, like Brookings, for instance, has a .edu address. So they
wow.
Clearly
I
like
that.
They do. Yeah. So they're clearly, it's not just hidden away on this like policy page where they talk about their independence, but, literally in their web addresses. But they're also seen as governments in waiting. And that's an important point to hone in on.
What does that mean? Sorry.
Which it means that whenever there's a change of administration, then, for instance, if a center-left president is coming into office, then one of the places that they will frequently look to are like center-left think tanks, because they're seen as the experts that have built up this infrastructure to determine, that are ready from day one, from the get-go, to try and figure out what like a center-left foreign policy could look like, and same on the right, as we've seen with organizations like Heritage, and so.
They're holding tanks. They're places people go when their party is out of power. So, whether it's the left or the right, we saw with the Biden administration, all these folks from the Center for New American Security jump into the Biden administration when he gets elected. Tables turn in 2024. Trump fills his administration with folks from Heritage. Think tanks, they do a lot of great stuff. But one of the biggest, most important things is what Nick's talking about, holding tanks.
Well, and we had a headline just this last week. Former Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who I am not the biggest fan of his work in office, he got put on the board of a center-left think tank, the Center for American Progress. But I saw also that CAP had said that they were no longer publishing their donors, whereas they formerly used to, because they said they were concerned about getting targeted by the Trump administration. But they're also, serving this purpose that Nick just mentioned, sort of a holding cell, if you will, for former government officials until they find their next gig.
I mean, it's really a disturbing trend that we're seeing. And the report that Nick mentioned, our Big Ideas and Big Money, is a report that accompanied the think tank funding tracker. And in that, we go into this, and we found when we looked at those top 50 think tanks, more than a third of them don't disclose anything about their donors. 17 of the 50 don't disclose a word about who's funding them, let alone how much, to what extent. So, that's very troubling, because we know on one hand that the money matters, that, there's all these mechanisms where it's influencing think tank work, whether it's through outright censorship, which is uncommon, but a lot of times it just works through self-censorship. If you have a particular funder at the organization where you work, you're just going to be a lot less likely to say mean things about them.
Right.
But if you want to test the theory, say mean things about them and see how long you're still employed. You know, there's a Darwinian system at work here. So we know the funding matters, and yet we have a third of these top think tanks, and these are the best think tanks, you know, our most prestigious think tanks in the U.S., and they're not disclosing anything. So we have no idea what the conflicts of interest look like. You know, we have no idea if they're saying something that would support their funders. So there's a reason that the American public right now doesn't have a lot of trust in think tanks. They sort of get the idea that think tanks are on the take. And frankly, they're right.
Right. Well, and this is not just like a left or right phenomenon, right? Like this is think tanks across the ideological spectrum.
100%. I mean, that's I mean, I was gonna note that, like, I've been saying center right, center left, which isn't always a useful distinction when talking about think tanks, especially as it relates to foreign policy, because, you know, the fact that a organization that identifies as progressive is hiring back someone that time and time again denied that Israel was denying humanitarian aid to Gaza can then be hired back as a, you know, on the board of a quote unquote progressive organization or think tank is very discouraging for a number of reasons. But it's the same thing on the right, right? So there's a lot of think tanks, both that identify on the left and identify as on the right, that are in favor of you know, primacist foreign policies, that are in favor of sending arms to Israel, to Ukraine, to Taiwan, to you know, half the countries around the globe. And, you know, that's, I think, where, you know, not to like toot our own horn, we all work at the Quincy Institute, but like we need more organizations that are not funded by companies and foreign governments that have those interests at play. We need to build up an infrastructure of organizations that, you know, are not just trying to decide like what Lockheed Martin wants, and instead kind of what should be in the U.S. national interest.
So I think I understand why, for instance, like, okay, obviously taking money from defense contractors, as you guys have laid out, may affect someone like, you know, some researchers own research, right? Because they don't want to lose that funding. That seems pretty clear. So they're going to end up doing things like, you know, asking for us to incentivize buying more Lockheed Martin weapons or sending those Lockheed Martin weapons to Taiwan, something like that. I guess I'm a little curious where the foreign government aspect comes in, right? Like, I'm a little less clear on why is it so bad for the UAE, for instance, to be funding, I don't even know, the countless think tanks that they do fund. And like, what's so wrong with that? And I guess my follow-up question, just really quick, would be like, does the U.S., this is like a genuine question, does the U.S. Fund foreign think tanks the same way that foreign governments fund U.S. think tanks?
Absolutely. And I think for a lot of reasons, those countries should be asking the same questions we are about the foreign government funding coming in. And you brought up the UAE, so I'm happy to beat up on the UAE a little bit when it comes to think tank funding. What we found was the UAE was the top foreign government donor to U.S. think tanks. You know, they contribute in billions of dollars every year to think tanks. And we think that really matters because the UAE, number one, it's an authoritarian regime. Number two, the UAE, especially in recent years, has not shied away from getting involved in foreign conflicts and in destabilizing conflicts. I think the two best examples are what they've done in Yemen to further destabilize the situation there, and the situation in Sudan. Arguably, the RSF in Sudan, that's one of the parties fighting the civil war there. Arguably, the RSF wouldn't exist, or at least wouldn't exist to the extent it does, without UAE support. And the cost of that is enormous. You know, you have thousands of lives lost and, you know, an ongoing civil war, destabilization, you know, all sorts of problems there. And so you have these think tanks that are being funded by them. Those issues that I just mentioned, you can go to their websites and try to find those issues that I just mentioned. Try to find anyone at those organizations saying anything remotely like what I just said. You can't. And, this isn't to say that, every person there is sort of bought off or anything like that.
Right.
But it gets back to that self-censorship element that I mentioned, that if the UAE is making a seven-figure donation to the organization where you work every year, you're just going to be a lot less likely to say mean things about them. And I
Right.
think at the very least, the consumers of that think tank's work should be made aware of that.
Well, and I think you hear this pushback from these organizations. They're like, "Yeah, we took the check, but the memo line didn't say don't write about Sudan." But it doesn't have to,
It
right?
doesn't have to. Exactly. Yeah. It doesn't, like, if somebody's giving you $1 million check, they don't have to say, but be nice to me now. Be nice to me. Please, because you get it. Because next year, when you work, I've worked in the think tank space for 15 years now, over 15 years. Your donor this year will hopefully be your donor next year. And so you're going to come back to them next year and they're going to ask you, like, okay, well, what have you done for me? And you better have a good answer. And that answer better not be like, well, I only said a couple mean things about you.
Right, right.
Another point to your question, Courtney, is that a lot of times those interests of foreign governments dovetail with the interests of defense contractors. And, this happens time and time again. I mean, one that comes to mind with the UAE is a few years ago, they were interested in importing drones from the U.S. But they weren't allowed to. They weren't a part of what's called the MTCR, and so they funded this think tank study to basically explore the potential costs and benefits, emphasis probably on benefit, of the UAE joining the MTCR so that they could import drones. And so they paid $250,000 to Center for a New American Security, which is another one of these center-left think tanks that has far more, I should say, ties to the defense industry than Center for American Progress. Even in this is one of those rare cases where the details of the contract actually leaks. And so we do know some of the details around like how that grant was agreed upon. And it revealed a pretty collaborative endeavor between the UAE and CNAS, where they were even at one point exchanging emails, and the Emirati ambassador to the U.S. was helping dictate the terms of the project itself. And sure enough, when the project comes out, this big paper, it says that the UAE should be one of the countries that the U.S. is able to export certain drone technology to.
Okay, so that seems pretty obvious, right? A pretty obvious conflict of interest. So you're saying UAE signs a contract with CNAS. CNAS goes, "We'll write this paper for you," and presumably then that paper is seen by people in government who then can greenlight us sending drones to the UAE, or are there even I don't even know if there is any oversight.
You laid the script out, Courtney. That is exactly what happened. So this happened in the late teens that this report came out, and this collaboration between it was the ambassador from the UAE to the U.S., Ambassador Otaiba. He had this collaboration with CNAS. And a couple of years later, the Trump administration did exactly what you said. They announced an arms sale offer to the UAE that would have given them these advanced drones. The deal didn't go through, but it was a clear example of this kind of what at the time was a crazy idea, just starting with a think tank and then going all the way through to we got on the footstep of giving this authoritarian regime in the Middle East some of our most advanced military technology. And it all started at a think tank. That's
beautiful. I think it's a really well-functioning system that we have here. And I guess that brings me back to this thing you said at the very beginning, which is well, it came from my genius question, which is, what is a think tank? And you kind of answered well, there's no real definition, right? And so I assume that makes it very difficult, right, to regulate an industry that is undefined, even in the tax bracket of it all, right? How would the IRS even begin to define, what is a think tank?
So think tanks are 501c3s. At least they start as just a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Okay. So as far as the IRS is concerned, they are regulated like any other nonprofit, like a Red Cross contribution, Habitat for Humanity, that sort of thing. They'll fall into the same, nonprofit bucket. Where think tanks do get a little interesting, though, is that some think tanks, in addition to having a 501c3, they have a 501c4, which allows them to engage in explicitly political type activity. Now, if you ask the think tanks about this, they'll say like, "Oh no, those two things, they're completely separate. We've got our nerds over here doing the think tank work, and then we've got our political people over here. They're doing the political stuff. The two shall not intertwine." I'm going to tell you right now, it's BS. The two organizations, they operate under. I know so many organizations who operate like this. They operate under the same roof. Sometimes the very same people are reporting on their timesheets C3 work and C4 work. It is literally the same people doing both of these functions. But the kicker is that the foreign governments, well, they can't contribute to the C4 for the political work. They can only do the nonprofit work. So they're only funding the nerds, right? But the nerds are the same people as the political activity people.
Okay.
And the roof over their head that a foreign government might be paying for, well, that's also paying for the C4, the political activity function. So while it's technically illegal for foreign governments to make political contributions in the U.S., they can totally fund a think tank that's doing all kinds of political work.
Could you speak a little bit about our friend, General John Allen of Brookings?
This was the pinnacle, the point person at that top think tank, John Allen. He was the president of Brookings at the time, and revelations came out a couple years ago that he was being investigated for his ties to the government of Qatar, and allegedly for, according to the investigation, wasn't even an indictment. So there was never, charges were never made against him. So, everything I'm saying now is, only coming from this sort of publicly revealed sort of investigatory notes. But allegedly from that, he had agreed to take a small sum of money from the government of Qatar in exchange for giving a speech and, doing some sort of lobbying like activities on behalf of the Qataris in the U.S. Where I think this case is really important for folks to know about is that we do also have another law in the U.S. that can apply to think tanks, and that's the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And under FARA, this is the preeminent law for regulating foreign lobbying in the U.S. And under FARA, if you're taking money from a foreign government and you're engaging in political activities, like lobbying, PR, that sort of thing, you've got to register under FARA. You got to disclose what you're doing and, tell everybody about it, disclose the money, most importantly. Most think tanks that take foreign government money, in fact, with very few exceptions, most think tanks that are taking foreign government money, they're not registered under FARA. Brookings wasn't registered under FARA. John Allen was not registered under FARA for any of this work. And so there is sort of this, there's a belief out there now, or at least a concern in the think tank community, that some think tanks are really skirting the law here, or, maybe coming very close to it, if not stepping over that line.
Is that because you can distinguish between like expert testimony and like outright lobbying? Like lobbying, you don't technically have to be an expert, or like how is that even? I don't understand how you can get around the FARA.
There are no those Venn diagrams you just mentioned, lobbyist and foreign policy expert, those can be perfectly overlapped.
Wow.
Both of those things can happen at the same time. And we mentioned before think tankers testifying before Congress. Lobbyists can testify before Congress too. Right. People just know it, and they could be doing the exact same kind of activities, but one is just labeled as a lobbyist, and the other is just a think tank expert who just happens to get money from a foreign government who the hearing is about. And that person's not registered under FARA.
It sounds like lobbyists should just like start working at think tanks, because lobbyists put such a bad taste in my mouth. But think tank, I go, oh, that's an expert. They know what they're talking about.
You are not the first person to have that realization.
It sounds like it.
And I think think tanks largely exist for that reason.
The government of Israel, as a matter of fact, I think it was the Washington Post, or maybe it was the Times, that broke a story a few months back about the government of Israel was considering starting a think tank explicitly to get around FARA regulations.
That actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because I really would encourage people to go to the think tank funding tracker.
Yeah.
You're seeing the URL on the webpage right here, and you got to click on it to learn a little bit more about both the governments and the Pentagon contractors who contribute to these think tanks, and also the think tanks that don't publish any of their funders, and those that do and receive big money from all sorts of fun friends abroad and at home in the military industrial complex. But I bring up my question is, one country that doesn't show up on that list, and I found that notable, and I've had people ask me about that, is the government of Israel, which I think people do have a perception, has a pretty, invests in influencing U.S. politics via groups like AIPAC. So why aren't they playing in the think tank funding space?
A big important thing that folks need to know about the think tank funding tracker: think tanks are not legally required to disclose any of their donors. And, as we point out, more than a third of the top think tanks don't disclose anything. And when you're talking about a foreign government donor, and I think that this is perhaps more applicable to China. China's another one where folks have come to us and said, where's China in here? I know they're trying to influence the U.S. and, China's missing, Israel's missing. This is all biased. The simple answer with a country like China not being in the think tank funding tracker is that because China has this huge stigma right now in the DC policy space, if you're a think tank taking money from China, you're just not going to disclose it. You're just not going to put it on your website. You're going to take that big check, whatever it is, and you're going to put it into the bank account. You're not going to tell anybody about it, and you're going to go about doing your business. With Israel, there might be some of that, might not, but a lot of the Israeli influence that's happening in the U.S., it's coming from places like AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and there's a reason. I've talked to folks at AIPAC. There's a reason the A is first and not the I, because this is an organization run by Americans, and we can certainly debate about its ties to the government of Israel and that sort of thing. But
sure.
So far as we know, the money is coming from U.S. citizens, and it's being run by U.S. citizens. So AIPAC doesn't register under FARA, and so money coming from AIPAC or AIPAC connected folks, it's not reported. It's not technically a foreign government contribution. So as far as the think tank funding tracker is concerned, we didn't score any sort of AIPAC contribution as a foreign government contribution.
So like a think tank could be taking a zillion, let's use a really precise number, could be taking a zillion dollars from Israel and turning around and producing, or from China and turning around and producing research that's, beneficial to their image or their argument. You could be taking that money and no one can compel you to
No.
reveal that.
We actually had a good example. I'm blanking on the woman's name, but there was a think tank that got busted for exactly this. Was taking a lot of money from the government of China, was doing effective lobbying, PR type work, not registering under FARA, and was indicted for violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and there are other crimes related to it too.
Even the think tanks that are relatively transparent will allow for anonymous donors, so they can anonymize any donation. Like you can pull up, the Atlantic Council's donor list, and you'll see like 1 million plus anonymous. And most
no one gives me anonymous donations, and it's really kind of icking my vibes right now. I'm so jealous.
I think you should take that personally.
I do.
We'll also put Courtney's Venmo right here. That's fascinating and dispiriting. Well, like while we're talking about, like, could we do some naming and shaming? Like, who are these think tanks that don't publish their info, who are prominent in the U.S., and then who are some of the ones that take a ton of money from foreign governments or military contractors? And are there any examples of them then turning around and producing some research that happens to align with their donors' interests?
We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the Atlantic Council here. As we found in our research, they're the number one recipient of foreign government money and the number one recipient of defense contractor money. It's hard to find a think tank that's taking more money from these groups. You literally can't. And when we take a hard look at the Atlantic Council, I will say they're commendably transparent about how much money they're taking from all of these folks. And it also, when you look at their work, it really seems like it's beneficial to these donors. They have a conflict of interest policy on their website and everything, and yet we see a lot of their research that would clearly look to benefit these donors. And through some leaked emails, we know that they do have direct engagement with some of these donors when they're putting out research projects. We mentioned the UAE earlier. Some leaked emails came out saying that, the Atlanta Council too was having these direct conversations with the ambassador from the UAE to the US. And the ambassador was getting the right to read reports before they were written or before they were published. And to provide
what you're saying
comments.
is like literally hurting my jaw. What?
No, literally. Yeah. He was allowed to provide comment on reports before they came out. And, of course, the Atlanta Council can take it or not take it, as they see fit. But, we know that, this level of donor interaction is happening there.
So the biggest ones that don't disclose their donors at all are Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, American Enterprise Institute. Those are the three that are testifying the most to Congress. I was curious, so I looked at the last couple of years to see who was testifying to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and those three are testifying all the time, and they don't disclose their donors. And I'll just note also, when you testify to Congress, Ben knows because he has testified to Congress, you have to fill out a form, which is called a truth and testimony form. And one of the questions on that form is, have you or your organization received foreign government funding in the last 36 months? Some forms say have slightly different versions, there are variations, but there's some form of that question, and then also a question about other potential conflicts of interest, just so that lawmakers can be aware of them. But at the top of that form, it asks, are you testifying in your organizational capacity, or are you testifying in a personal capacity? Courtney, are you testifying as Courtney Rawlings, or are you testifying as Courtney Rawlings, the foreign policy analyst and Always at War co-host? Right. And it's
yet to be asked, but I am open.
And it's a ridiculous idea, because it's like, you're there because of your job, right? Like, you can't really divorce those two things. And like Ben said earlier in this conversation, like, people are always aware of who their funders are. So even if you say, I'm not doing this in my professional capacity, well, of course, you're aware of what you need to do to keep the lights on at night.
Nick, I got to jump in and say one of the craziest things you found in that research was so many people who would, check the box, I'm testifying in my personal capacity, and then they would send in their statement on their company's letterhead.
So can't keep the story straight.
I'm testifying as myself, but here's Quincy Institute letterhead.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally random.
So people really are just skirting this stuff, which tells me that they're not taking it seriously. They don't care, or that they're concealing things, or a little bit of both.
Because at the end of the day, if you knew, some of the organizations that Nick mentioned, they offer very critical takes about certain countries in the world, and I would say notably the government of Qatar. And with some of these organizations, there's a belief that they might be taking money from Qatar's rivals, UAE, Saudi Arabia, perhaps Israel. But we have no idea, because they don't disclose those funders. And so then they go to testify and, they'll say mean things about Qatar or some other country. But because you don't know the money that's behind them, you can't put those comments, take those comments with a grain of salt. There might be a conflict of interest there, but you have no idea. And yet over and over again, as Nick has found, these folks keep being asked to testify over and over again.
I saw one recently. There's this guy it's an organization called the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which is an organization that has actually we know it's been funded by Israel in the past, at least on one occasion. It got a grant, I believe in 2019, that has testified numerous times to Congress, and even his organization takes credit for this series of hearings about anti-Semitism on campuses in response to a lot of the protests that have been taking place. And he has, in his truth and testimony form, he didn't answer the question, and then he also didn't sign the form at the bottom.
And it's like whenever you publish an article in a medical journal, there's this conflict of interest statement, like right at the beginning of it. But yet we cross over to the foreign policy space, like literally questions of war and peace, and we're just like, conflict of interest? Nah.
Well, I mean, our own Congress people are taking, get millions in stock have made millions off the, defense industry stock. So it's like, I don't see a universe where the United States takes seriously, right, these blatant conflicts of interest, which is why I think the American people are getting more and more annoyed by even places like New York Times, who continues to cite think tanks who are very openly, biased in their opinions, and refuse to, disclose those biases. And they, it shouldn't have to be my job as an American citizen to go to the think tank funding tracker, which I think everyone should do, and research whether or not the person who's being cited in X, newspaper column is speaking out of both sides of their mouth. And yet that is all completely my responsibility. And I guess that brings me to like one of our final questions, but don't you think you can get away? We have one more after this from us, but what is the solution? And is there a viable one at all?
We'll start where you started your question, Courtney. That's with journalists. One of the big groups that we created the think tank funding tracker for was journalists, because we were hearing from too many journalists. We complained that they would cite somebody from a think tank who had funding from a foreign government or had funding from the defense sector, and they didn't tell the readers about it. And we were hearing from journalists, they're like, we just don't have time to track down the funding of every source that we cite. It's just not something we can do quickly. So we said, all right, whole industry of journalists covering war, we got you. We're going to make it easy for you. And this is why we went and took a look at the top 50 think tanks. We said, like, these are the think tanks that are being cited all the time. And so we said, we're going to do it so you don't have to. So now with one click, if you want to know, is a defense contractor that one of your sources is talking about, are they funded by them? With one click, you can go to Think Tank Funding Tracker and you can find that information. So we created that for journalists. We want journalists to use this. Journalists, we think, should be proactive about identifying those conflicts of interest in their sources, particularly, again, when it comes to questions of war and peace. And then another big bucket for us is educating our friends in Congress. We think, per our previous conversation, it's a shame that people in Congress, members of Congress, are getting testimony from folks who have these biases. So we want Congress to come in and strengthen those truth and testimony rules to make sure that everybody who's testifying before Congress, there's no loopholes. Like if you're getting money from a foreign government, you're getting money from somebody, a defense contractor who's the subject matter of that hearing, you have to disclose it. There's no getting out of it. That way, at least members of Congress know if there's a conflict of interest there. And finally, for your last segment, the American public at large, we think it should be mandatory that think tanks disclose their funding.
Yeah.
There's some laws that would require this, already. Think Tank Transparency Act's one of them. And we think the very least that if you're a think tank that's trying to influence public policy, the least you can do is tell the American public who's funding you. If you have nothing to hide, prove it. Don't hide anything. Put those funders out there and let the chips fall where they may.
And if I can make a plea to think tanks directly, I don't know if Tony Blinken is a listener.
I think he's a regular listener.
He's a regular. Now he has a lot more time on his hands. But yeah, I think that think tanks should want to disclose their funding source. There have been polls done on like how, to your first question, like how Americans think about think tanks, if they think anything at all. First of all, they don't. Most Americans don't know what a think tank is. But second of all, if they do know what a think tank is, the vast majority of Americans don't trust think tanks because they believe that a think tank expert might have a hidden agenda of some sort. And so
well, it sounds like they do.
and in a lot of cases they do, right? And so I think if think tanks want to regain the trust of the American people, then they should put their cards on the table, disclose their finances.
Yeah.
I think that's part of like this broader shift that I would like to see in the think tank community of just sort of redefining our relationship to donors. Because what happens right now is like all think tanks say that they're objective, academic, independent, but then at the same time, they simultaneously have to signal this dependence to their donors privately, know that they can continue pushing out products that are in line with their donors, so that they continue to get that check year after year. And so I think that it would be for the betterment of the industry itself if they put their cards on the table.
Some of the most brilliant and imaginative men in the world are gathered here developing new weapons of defense that may someday play the major part in beating back a powerful aggressor. It is their job to keep the United States ahead of the rest of the world in the field of guided missiles.
And that, I guess, brings us to our final question. What we've been talking about is pretty disheartening, like in general, for the reasons that we've laid out over the last hour, 45 minutes or whatever. Like, do think tanks, and this is just like a straightforward question, like, do think tanks keep us fighting wars? Like, are think tanks part of the reason that we are always at war?
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, we even have some quantitative ways where we've gotten at this. And, one of those, I did a study when the Ukraine war broke out, and we took a look at what think tanks were saying about the war, and what they thought the level of U.S. involvement should be. And one of the most stunning findings that we had was when we looked at the major media outlets that were citing folks at think tanks. It was almost 88% of the time they were citing think tanks who were taking money from the defense sector.
Okay.
So these are so in other words, like when you were hearing about the Ukraine war, you were hearing from people who were funded by the folks who were profiting from the Ukraine war. So it will not shock your listeners to hear that these think tanks almost unflinchingly suggested that the U.S. should provide the Ukraine with more weapons. Which of course came from their funders. So now we can all think what we want about, what should the level of support have been for Ukraine? I agree that was terrible, the Russian invasion. But at the very least, again, when we're hearing about war from journalists, we're reading about it. I think we should have more balance in terms of, are we getting information from folks who are profiting from that war? Are we getting information from folks who are not profiting from that war? And like folks at Quincy who might just be objective purveyors or have an objective opinion about what's going on in that war.
Well, and that's such a good point, because the line at that time, I remember when you published that, the line coming out of a grand majority of U.S. think tanks was, there's only a military solution to this. You can't think about negotiation. There's no such thing as negotiating with Putin. The only way that this will end is with Ukrainian military victory, and that can only be facilitated through an endless supply of weapons. And
and it worked.
Well, yeah, no, it didn't. This many years later, that proved wrong. I remember a specific article criticizing Quincy's urging of early diplomacy said, they say the alternative to protracted war, or the alternative to diplomacy is protracted war. It's not. Ukraine is going to win. And these folks who were funded, many of them by defense contractors, were wrong. And Ukraine has suffered enormously in the intervening years when there's not been a proactive effort from its biggest supporters in the U.S. and Europe to reach a diplomatic solution, because they saw the answer as more military hardware, never talk. And I'm, what an incredibly depressing state of affairs that is held up.
We'll have Alex be signing a truth and testimony form
Yeah,
after this. Make sure he's not receiving Kremlin funding.
But
I would say to Alex, I mean, to that point, and there's been no mea culpa from any of those think tanks, who were clamoring, no recognition that, what we said there was a little bit wrong. And, I point this out because it's not, all of this isn't just happening in a vacuum. I think a lot of think tankers operate with this ridiculous notion that nobody listens to what they're saying, or that, oh, I'm just an academic, I'm just an intellectual. The administration was believing them, and, they fell into this. And one of the most vivid examples that we saw after the fact, we did a follow-up analysis to that report, looking specifically at folks who were writing aggressively that the U.S. should give Ukraine Abrams tanks. And if folks remember, this was a hot button issue for a while, and think tanks were weighing in on it. And unsurprisingly, think tanks that with funding from the manufacturer of the Abrams tank were just clamoring for the U.S. to send Abrams tanks. What happened was, when those tanks hit the battlefield, they got destroyed. They were useless. And the vast majority of them were kaput, inoperational in under 6 months. The tragedy of that is think tanks clamoring for them to be put out there is that Ukrainian soldiers died in those things. It set back. This wasn't just like we wanted to give the Ukrainians more. The voices that were saying maybe tanks are a bad idea got drowned out by the voices of folks being funded by the manufacturers of that tank, and people died because of it. Now, all of those people who were clamoring for more tanks, again, no mea culpa, no nothing. And Ukrainian soldiers are dead because of it.
Where can everyone find you? Ben, I know you have a new book coming out. Do you want to just quickly plug that? Do you want to plug your guys' socials? Where can we find you, and what's up next?
Absolutely. The $1 Trillion War Machine is our book.
Hell yeah.
With Bill Hartung. Find it where all good books are sold. Well, our good books and our book. It's a wonderful book with our Quincy Institute colleague, Bill Hartung. Please check that out. I'm on X at Ben Freeman, DC as well for all my current snark.
How about you, Nick?
You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, which I guess is what we're supposed to say. And I am at Nick_Cleveland_S.
Seriously, guys, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Roll credits.
If we are indeed prepared, if we look ahead rather than behind, if we keep pace with tomorrow, no potential enemy will underestimate us. No potential aggressor will miscalculate. No potential troublemaker will dare strike.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Don't forget to follow the Quincy Institute at Quincy INST all across social media. Check out our website, quincyinst.org, to learn more about the work that my colleagues are doing to try and imagine a more peaceful world and a more restrained U.S. foreign policy. Please, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to like the video, but also subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to some of the podcast apps, leave us that glowing review that you've been meaning to leave. Give us a 5-star rating while you're at it too. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Peace.